So we just finished a lecture in week 5 on the gram-negative bacilli, but those were the fastidious organisms. We're now moving on to another group of gram-negative bacilli or gram-negative rods, and these are the enteric gram-negative rods, and they are the family Enterobacteriaceae. There are many genera included in the Enterobacteriaceae family. You'll see that there are actually more organisms in the Enterobacteriaceae family than we have studied in this entire course thus far. So it's very important not to start slacking off in any studying, because I personally find the Enterobacteriaceae organisms the most difficult organisms because there's so many of them, and the only way to differentiate some of them is through their biochemical characteristics. So all of those biochemical tests need to be memorized. So the Enterobacteriaceae, you really need to start memorizing these materials as soon as possible, because the second exam actually has more organisms on it than the first exam did. So the first exam is difficult because it's the first exam, you're not exactly sure what types of questions there's going to be. The second exam is incredibly difficult because there are so many organisms on the exam. And then you also have to consider that the final exam includes all of the material we cover throughout the entire semester. So by the time the final exam gets here, if you haven't memorized all the material in smaller portions, it's going to be far too overwhelming to try to memorize everything at that point. So we're going to start with the Enterobacteriaceae, and we're going to start off by naming off the genera included in the Enterobacteriaceae family. So we have our opportunistic organisms. These are organisms that normally wouldn't be associated with disease, but in the right situation, in the right individual, they will cause disease. So these are opportunistic organisms, and the organisms in the opportunistic category are the genus Escherichia, Enterobacter, Chronobacter, Pantoia, Edwardziella, Klebsiella, Proteus, Serratia, Citrobacter, Hafnia, Morganella, Providencia, Erwinia, and Pectobacterium. Now that's a lot of organisms. We move on to the genera that are also in the Enterobacteriaceae family. However, these organisms are always considered pathogens. Our opportunistic organisms on the previous slide, most of those are normal flora of the gastrointestinal tract and will occasionally cause disease. These three organisms, Salmonella, Shigella, and Yersinia, should never be in the GI tract unless the individual is infected. And there are numerous other genera in the Enterobacteriaceae family. They include Budavicea, Butaxella, Sedecia, Ewingella, Clivera, Leclercia, Laminarella, Mullorella, Photorhabdus, Pragia, Ronella, Tatumella. There's many organisms, as I said, in the Enterobacteriaceae family. Now we focus in this course on the organisms that are associated with disease, or the medically relevant organisms. So some of the organisms on this slide we will mention, but these organisms are not highly associated with disease in humans, so we won't talk extensively about most of these organisms. So in general, the Enterobacteriaceae family has 44 genera and 176 species. So again, lots of organisms in this family. They are all gram-negative bacilli or gram-negative rods, and they are all non-spore formers. They are all facultative organisms. So these are very hardy organisms. They can grow with low oxygen. They can grow in the presence of oxygen. They could grow almost anywhere. Now, we've already talked about some gram-negative rods in our last lecture, and we are going to talk about gram-negative rods in subsequent lectures after week 6 as well. So there's a lot of gram-negative rods. Now we categorize the Enterobacteriaceae in their own group because all of the Enterobacteriaceae members ferment glucose. I would put a star next to this. None of the Enterobacteriaceae family members produce cytochrome oxidase, so they are all oxidase negative, and they all reduce nitrates to nitrites. So if you remember in week 5, we talked about the fussy gram-negative rods. And in the fussy gram-negative rods, some of those were oxidase positive. Some of them did not ferment carbohydrates at all. So that's why some of those organisms are not categorized in the Enterobacteriaceae family. So you must know that all of the members of the Enterobacteriaceae family ferment glucose, are oxidase negative, and reduce nitrates to nitrites. That those 3 things are key. All of the Enterobacteriaceae members also possess pili, and many are normal flora of the gastrointestinal tract. Now again, we already said that a lot of these organisms, their natural habitat is the human intestines. They are distributed widely in nature, but there are some organisms that are never considered normal flora. And we already mentioned these. These are the pathogens. They're always considered pathogens. There's Salmonella, Shigella, and Yersinia. And then there's also some pathogenic strains of E. coli. So Escherichia coli is normal flora. However, there are specific strains of Escherichia coli, the pathogenic E. coli, such as 0157H7, that would not be considered normal flora. Many of our Enterobacteriaceae members have virulence factors, especially our pathogens. These are all gram-negative organisms, so they all have lipopolysaccharide or endotoxin. Some of them can produce entero or intestinal toxins, hemolysins. Some of these have capsules, and you remember the capsules are antiphagocytic. They have pili, which allows them to attach to host cells. And there are antigenic properties associated with the Enterobacteriaceae members. There are O antigens, and these are on the cell wall. These resist heat and alcohol, and they will produce an IgM antibody response. There's also the H antigens, or the flagella, and the H antigens are only going to be found on the flagellated organisms, or the motile organisms. Now the H antigens are destroyed by heat and alcohol, and they will generate an IgG antibody production. The K antigens are capsular. So if an organism has a K antigen, it means that it produces a capsule, that polysaccharide capsule, and the capsule is antiphagocytic and also serves as an attachment site. The there's many different types of diseases that you can get in the gastrointestinal tract. So there's gastroenteritis, or inflammation of the mucous membranes of both the stomach and the intestines. There's enterocolitis, which is inflammation of the mucous membranes of the small and large intestine. There's colitis, which is inflammation of the mucous membranes of the large intestine. And then there's dysentery, and this is a specific disease. A lot of people call diarrhea dysentery, but they're two very different clinical diseases. Dysentery has a watery stool like diarrhea, but it also is going to contain blood and mucus. So diarrhea is loose, watery stool without blood, and dysentery generally has the blood and a lot of mucus in it. Now, transmission of our enteric organisms are fecal-oral. There have been some associations with insects, fomites, as well as contaminated food. Now, some of our Enterobacteriaceae family members, especially Escherichia coli, are highly associated with causing urinary tract infections. And we have several different types of infections of the urinary tract. These include cystitis, which is inflammation of the urinary bladder, glomerulonephritis, which is inflammation of the kidney and involving the glomeruli. This is usually a descending infection. You can also find hematuria, or blood in the urine, proteinuria, protein in the urine, casts. A lot of time you'll see casts in the urine. You'll see edema, swelling, fluid buildup, and high blood pressure. You can also get pyelonephritis. This is inflammation of the kidney and the pelvis. This usually causes symptoms such as an urgency and burning during urination, and this is usually an ascending infection. Transmission of urinary tract infections can happen through catheterization. So an individual that is undergoing a procedure that is catheterized has a very high risk of getting a urinary tract infection. Individuals with anatomical abnormalities, any type of manipulation in the area, in the bladder region, and of course bacteremia. Any organism that gets into the bloodstream can go anywhere into the body and cause infection. There are other types of diseases that the Enterobacteriaceae family members cause, such as respiratory diseases like inhalation diseases or aspiration pneumonia. There are central nervous system diseases, sinus infections, bacteremias. So pretty much the Enterobacteriaceae can cause all different types of diseases in humans. Now, prevention and control, of course, treating sewage systems, proper cooking of food, proper food preparation. So don't cut raw meats on, let's say, a cutting board and then use that same cutting board to then cut vegetables for a salad that you're not going to cook. Using insecticides. Some of these organisms, there are vaccines available, and of course our best prevention and control is hand washing. So we're going to move on now to the second part of the Enterobacteriaceae lecture.